I was 31 years old the first time I genuinely considered disappearing. Not the dramatic kind of disappearing. Not vanishing without a trace or staging something terrible. I mean the quiet kind, packing a single bag, pointing my car toward a highway I'd never driven, and simply never calling home again. I'd thought about it before in fleeting ways, the way you think about quitting a job you hate on a Tuesday afternoon. But the night of my parents' anniversary dinner, sitting at a table where everyone laughed at my sister's jokes and talked over mine, the thought didn't flutter through my mind and leave. It settled. It unpacked its bags. It started looking like the most reasonable thing I'd ever considered. My name is Cassidy Monroe, and I grew up the second daughter in a household where being second meant being invisible. My sister Brenley was 3 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand what favoritism was, I understood that it lived in our house like a piece of furniture nobody acknowledged but everyone worked around. Brenley was taller, louder, and more comfortable taking up space. She laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. She borrowed things without asking and returned them broken or not at all. She got CS in school and was told she was trying her best, while I brought home straight A's and was warned not to get arrogant. My mother, Deborah, was the kind of woman who had constructed her entire emotional world around Brenley. Brenley was her first, her longest project, the child who had arrived before she fully understood what motherhood would ask of her. There was a tenderness there that I think started genuine and calcified over the years into something more like obligation. Deborah had built a version of Brenley in her mind that Brenley could never fully live up to, and rather than adjusting the image, my mother adjusted her behavior. If Brenley was struggling, it was the world's fault. If Brenley was cruel, she was stressed. If Brenley failed, there was always someone else had let her down. My father, Roy, was not a malicious man. That was the part that took me years to untangle. Roy was simply passive in the way that certain men of his generation learned to be. He married a woman with strong opinions and found it easier to align himself with her than to develop his own. Where Deborah looked at Brenley and saw her reflection, Roy looked at Deborah and saw the path of least resistance. And so by the time I was old enough to need my father's advocacy, had already made a quiet agreement with himself that disagreeing with Deborah cost more than it was worth. I don't think Roy ever sat down and decided not to protect me. I think he just never sat down and decided to. There's a difference, technically. It never felt like one. I built a life in spite of all of it. That's what people who grow up in the shadow of someone else's favorite do. We construct ourselves with the materials left over, and we become deeply, almost obsessively competent, because competence is the only currency that doesn't require someone else's approval to spend. I went to college on a merit scholarship. I graduated into a job at a mid-size logistics company in Columbus, Ohio, and I worked there with the kind of focus that people mistake for passion. It wasn't passion. It was survival instinct dressed in business casual. I got promoted twice in 3 years. I built a savings account that would have made Roy's jaw drop if he'd ever asked about it, which he didn't. I rented a clean, spare apartment with good natural light and a bookshelf I'd filled with books I'd actually read, and I lived alone without it feeling like loneliness. Brenley, meanwhile, had carved a path through adulthood that required constant external reinforcement. She'd gotten married at 26 to a man named Dalton who had the particular brand of charm that only works on people who aren't paying attention. They'd bought a house they couldn't afford in a suburb outside of Cincinnati. Brenley had started and abandoned several small businesses, each one announced to the family with tremendous fanfare and shuttered without explanation. She called our parents 3 times a week. She asked them for money with a naturalness that suggested she'd never learned the word embarrassing. And every single time, they gave it to her. I asked for help once. I was 23, just out of school, and my car's transmission had failed on the interstate. I needed $800 to cover the repair until my first paycheck cleared. My mother said they were stretched thin. That was the same month they lent Brenley $3,000 to invest in a candle company that never produced a single candle. I paid for the transmission myself and I never asked again. But hey, race, the thing about growing up the way I did, you get very good at reading the room and you get very, very good at documentation. I kept receipts. Not out of spite, not initially. Out of habit. A therapist I saw in my late 20s named Dr. Anita Lawson told me that the people who grew up having their realities constantly rewritten by their families often became compulsive record keepers, because evidence was the only thing that protected them from gaslighting. I hadn't used that word about my family before, but when she said it, something in my chest acknowledged it with a slow, exhausted certainty. I had records of every loan Brenley had received from our parents. I had records because Brenley liked to talk, and when Brenley talked, I listened with the patience of someone who knew they'd need that information later. I knew about the $3,000 for the candles. The $4,000 for a used car when her second car was repossessed, though the family was told it was a voluntary surrender, which is not the same thing. The $1,200 for a vacation she and Dalton took to Myrtle Beach while my parents told me they couldn't make it to my work awards ceremony because of finances. The ongoing $500 here and $500 there that arrived every few months like a subscription nobody had cancelled. I kept the numbers in a spreadsheet ID labeled simply a reference. Not as ammunition. Dr. Lawson had helped me understand that keeping it wasn't about revenge. It was about anchoring myself in what was real when everything around me tried to convince me I was imagining things. The anniversary dinner happened in late October, a Saturday. My parents were celebrating their 35th anniversary, and Brenley had organized the dinner at a restaurant called the Granary in their hometown of Dayton, which happened to also be Brenley's hometown, since she'd never managed to move more than 40 minutes from my parents' house. I drove 2 hours from Columbus to be there. I'd taken the day off work. I'd bought them a gift, a weekend stay at a bed and breakfast in Yellow Springs that I'd researched carefully and paid for in full. The dinner was the kind of event that felt normal to everyone else in the room and like a low-grade emergency to me. Brenley arrived with Dalton and their 2 kids, Jackson and Remy, and she entered the restaurant the way she entered every room, like she'd been announced. She hugged our parents for a long time. She cried a little. She said it meant everything to her that they were still together, that they were her compass, her North Star, that she wouldn't be the woman she was without them. I sat across the table and thought about the transmission. When my mother opened our gifts, Brenley had given her a framed photo collage she'd clearly ordered online, the kind of thing with a template border that says family in cursive across the top. My parents held it up like it was sacred. They said it was the most thoughtful thing anyone had ever done for them. Then my mother opened my envelope. I'd written a card by hand, a real card, with real sentences, not the 4 words people write when they feel obligated. I'd talked about what their marriage had taught me about commitment. I'd included the reservation confirmation for the bed and breakfast. My mother said, "Oh, how sweet the way you say it about a child's drawing," and then she set it down and turned back to the photo collage. Roy never looked at the card at all. I drove home to Columbus that night with the particular kind of grief that doesn't produce tears because it isn't new. It's the grief of confirmation. The grief of being shown, one more time, a thing you already knew. I spent 3 weeks after that dinner thinking about what I actually wanted my life to look like. Not the version of it I'd been performing, competent, unbothered, the daughter who had it together and made no demands. The actual version. And what I kept coming back to was this: I was exhausted. I was 31 years old and I was exhausted from waiting for a family that was never going to show up in the way I needed. I started, in those 3 weeks, to build a plan. Not a revenge plan. I want to be precise about that, because the word revenge implies you want someone to suffer, and that wasn't what I felt. What I felt was closer to severance. I wanted to detach, cleanly and permanently, from a dynamic that had cost me more than I'd ever been repaid. And I wanted to do it in a way that was honest, documented, and irrefutable. I had a conversation with Dr. Lawson. I had a long conversation with my closest friend, a woman named Priya who had known me since our first year of college and who had watched the family situation from close enough proximity to have opinions. Priya did not tell me I was overreacting. She sat in my apartment with a cup of tea and said, "Whatever you decide, I will help you pack." What I decided was this: I would stop attending family events. I would stop calling. I would stop making myself available for the invisible labor of being the stable, uncomplicated daughter who required nothing. And before I withdrew, I would leave a letter, not a letter written in anger, but a letter written in the clear, level voice of a woman who had done her math and reached a conclusion. The letter took me 11 days to write. I rewrote it 5 times. Every draft, I took out the words that felt too hot, that had too much shake in them. What I wanted to leave behind wasn't an accusation. It was an accounting, a clear, sober ledger of what had happened, what it had cost me, and what I had decided to do with that information. I described, with specificity, the financial support Brenley had received over the years. I cited the amounts I remembered, and I was careful to say I remembered, not that I had proven. I described the anniversary dinner. I described the transmission at 23. I described coming second, consistently, in ways too mundane to argue with but too cumulative to dismiss. I told them I didn't hate them. I told them I had spent a long time believing that if I just became accomplished enough, steady enough, easy enough to love, the scales would balance. I told them I had stopped believing that. I told them I was stepping back from the family. Not forever, necessarily, but for the foreseeable future, and not out of punishment, but out of self-preservation. I told them that if they ever wanted to have an honest conversation, I would be willing to have it, but that I was no longer available to pretend. At the end of the letter, I included a single sentence that I had thought about for a long time before I decided to leave it in. I told them that there was a copy of the letter in a sealed envelope with my attorney, dated and signed, and that it was a matter of record. Not because I planned to do anything with it, but because I had spent my entire life having my perceptions dismissed, and I wanted there to exist somewhere in the world a document that said, this happened, this is what it looked like, and I was not confused about it. I mailed the letter to my parents' home on a Monday morning in December. I mailed a second copy to Brenley. Then I went to work, sat at my desk, and did my job. For 10 days, nothing happened. My mother called twice. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemails were not what ID expected, they weren't angry, they were confused, and underneath the confusion was something that sounded like fear, which was new. Roy called once and left a voicemail that was 40 seconds of silence followed by, I guess we'll talk soon, which was perhaps the most Roy thing had ever done. Brenley called on the 11th day. I answered because ID decided I would answer Brenley's call if it came, because I thought it might be useful to hear what she did with the information. She was not calm. She was vibrating in the particular register that Brenley vibrated when the world wasn't organizing itself around her comfort. She said she couldn't believe I would do this. She said the letter was cruel. She said ID made it sound like she was the problem, when she had just been living her life, when she hadn't done anything to me, when everything ID described was in my head. I let her talk. When she stopped, I said, I didn't write the letter to get a reaction from you, Brenley. I wrote it because it was true, and I wanted there to be a record of it. She said, and I remember this very precisely because it is the kind of sentence you don't forget, you're joking. You actually think any of this matters? You think putting it in a letter makes it real? I said, it was already real. The letter just means I don't have to carry it alone anymore. She hung up. I sat in my apartment and felt something I hadn't expected. Not vindication, that word has a triumphant ring to it that doesn't quite fit. What I felt was stillness. The particular stillness that comes when you've been bracing for something for so long that when you finally stop bracing, your entire body doesn't know what to do with the absence of tension. The weeks after that were not a dramatic redemption arc. My parents did not have a sudden awakening. They didn't call me in tears and say they finally understood. What happened was quieter and stranger than that. My mother started, for the first time in my adult life, asking me questions. Not performing interest, actually asking. She called a month after the letter and said she'd read it 3 times, and that she wasn't sure she agreed with everything in it, but that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about the part where I said ID stopped waiting for the scales to balance. She said, I didn't know you were waiting. I told her that was kind of the point. We didn't resolve anything in that call. I wasn't looking for resolution. What I was looking for was acknowledgement, and for the first time in my life, I got a version of it, incomplete, imperfect, wrapped in defensiveness, but present. Real. Undeniable. Roy sent me an email 2 weeks later. Roy, who I had never once received an unprompted email from. It was 4 sentences long. He said he was sorry ID felt overlooked. He said he thought I was stronger than Brenley and had assumed that meant I needed less. He said he understood now that was wrong. He said he'd like to have dinner sometime if I was willing. I read that email a lot of times. I haven't responded yet. Not because I don't want to, and not because I'm punishing him, but because I'm learning, slowly, still, that I'm allowed to take time. That I don't have to perform forgiveness before I've actually arrived at it. That being the steady, uncomplicated one doesn't mean I have to be ready on someone else's schedule. Brenley and I haven't spoken since that phone call. I've been told by Priya, who maintains a more diplomatic relationship with my family than I currently do, that Brenley has been telling people the letter was an attack and that I've always resented her success. I find that I can hold that information without needing to argue with it. Brenley's version of events has always been the version she needed it to be. That used to feel like a verdict on my reality. Now it just feels like a fact about Brenley. What I know, in the clearest part of myself, is this. I spent 3 decades contracting myself to fit into a space that was never designed for me. I arrived on time to every dinner, brought good gifts, asked after people's lives, and left my own unasked about. I did all of it with the quiet hope that if I was useful enough, easy enough, low maintenance enough, someone would eventually look at me and say, "We see you." The letter didn't make them see me. Letters don't have that kind of power. What it did was simpler and more durable than that. It made me stop needing them to. I turned 32 in March. Priya made a cake with too much frosting and we ate it at my kitchen table with the windows open, and we talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, and I drove her to her car at midnight and came back to my clean, spare apartment and sat on my couch in the dark for a while. Not out of sadness. Out of something I'm still learning to identify. I think the closest word for it is mine.